5 minutes later, Mr. Harris rifled through a classified phone directory at the corner druggist's. A fine lot of sympathy one got from blind fools like Burley. He passed his finger down a list of bone specialists, found one named M. Monagant. Monagant lacked an M.D. or any other academic lettering behind his name, but his office was conveniently near, 3 blocks down, 1 block over. M. Monagant, like his office, was small and dark. Like his office, he smelled of iodoform, iodine, and other odd things. He was a good listener, though, and listened with eager, shiny moves of his eyes, and when he talked to Harris, his accent was such that he softly whistled each word, undoubtedly because of imperfect dentures. Harris told all. M. Monagant nodded. He had seen cases like this before. The bones of the body. Man was not aware of his bones. Ah, yes, the bones. The skeleton. Most difficult. Something concerning an imbalance, an unsympathetic coordination between soul, flesh, and skeleton. Very complicated. Softly whistled Mr. Monagant. Harris listened, fascinated. Now here was a doctor who understood his illness. Psychological, said Mr. Monagant. He moved swiftly, delicately, to a dingy wall, and slashed down 6 X-rays to haunt the room with their look of things found floating in an antecedent tide, in an ancient tide. Here, here, the skeleton surprised. Here, luminous portraits of the long, the short, the large, the small bones. Mr. Harris must be aware of his position, his problem. M. Monagant's hand tapped, rattled, whispered, scratched at faint nebulae of flesh, in which hung ghosts of cranium, spinal cord, pelvis, lime, calcium, marrow, here, there, this, that, these, those, and others. Look! Harris shuddered. The X-rays and the paintings blew in a green and phosphorescent wind from a land peopled by the monsters of Dali and Fusili. M. Monagant whistled quietly. Did Mr. Harris wish his bones treated? That depends, said Harris. Well, M. Monagant could not help Harris unless Harris was in the proper mood. Psychologically, one had to need help, or the doctor was useless. But, shrugging, M. Monagant would try. Harris lay on a table with his mouth open. The lights were switched off, the shades drawn. M. Monagant approached his patient. Something touched Harris's tongue. He felt his jawbones forced out. They creaked and made faint creaking noises. One of those skeleton charts on the dim wall seemed to quiver and jump. A violent shudder seized Harris. Involuntarily his mouth snapped shut. M. Monagant shouted. His nose had almost been bitten off. No use, no use. Now was not the time. M. Monagant whispered the shades up. Dreadfully disappointed. When Mr. Harris felt he could cooperate psychologically, when Mr. Harris needed help, and trusted M. Monagant to help him, then maybe something could be done. M. Monagant held out his little hand. In the meantime, the fee was only $2. Mr. Harris must begin to think. Here was a sketch for Mr. Harris to take home and study. It would acquaint him with his body. He must be tremendously aware of himself. He must be on guard. Skeletons were strange, unwieldy things. M. Monagant's eyes glittered. Good day to Mr. Harris. Oh, and would he care for a breadstick? M. Monagant proffered a jar of long, hard, salty breadsticks to Harris, taking one himself, saying that chewing breadsticks kept him in, practice. Good day to Mr. Harris. Mr. Harris went home. The next day, Sunday, Mr. Harris discovered innumerable fresh aches and pains in his body. He spent the morning, his eyes fixed, staring with new interest at the small, automatically perfect painting of the skeleton, anatomically perfect painting of a skeleton M. Monagant had given him. His wife, Clarice, startled him at dinner when she cracked her exquisitely long knuckles, one by one, until he clapped his hands to his ears and cried, "Stop!" The rest of the afternoon he quarantined himself in his room. Clarice played bridge in the parlor, laughing and chatting with 3 other ladies, while Harris, hidden away, fingered and weighed the limbs of his body with growing curiosity. After an hour he suddenly rose and called, "Clarice!" She had a way of dancing into any room, her body doing all sorts of soft, agreeable things to keep her feet from ever quite touching the nap of the rug. She excused herself from her friends and came to see him now brightly. She found him reseated in a far corner, and she saw that he was staring at the anatomical sketch. "Are you still brooding, sweet?" she asked. "Please don't." She sat down upon his knees. Her beauty could not distract him now. In his absorption, he juggled her lightness. He touched her kneecap suspiciously. It seemed to move under her pale, glowing skin. "Is it supposed to do that?" he asked, sucking in his breath. "Is what supposed to do what?" She laughed. "You mean my kneecap? Is it supposed to run around the top of your knee that way?" She experimented. "So it does," she marveled. "I'm glad yours slithers too," he sighed. "I was beginning to worry." "About what?" He patted his ribs. "My ribs don't go all the way down. They stop here. And I found some confounded ones that dangle in midair." Beneath the curve of her small breasts, Clarice clasped her hands. "Of course, silly. Everybody's ribs stop at a given point. And those funny short ones are floating ribs." "I hope they don't float around too much." The joke was most uneasy. Now, above all, he wished to be alone. Further discoveries, newer and stranger archaeological diggings, lay within reach of his trembling hands, and he did not wish to be laughed at. "Thanks for coming in, dear," he said. "Any time." She rubbed her small nose softly against his. "Wait! Here now." He put his finger to touch his nose and hers. "Did you realize the nose bone grows down only this far? From there on, a lot of grisly tissue fills out the rest." She wrinkled hers. "Of course, darling," she said, and she danced from the room. Now, sitting alone, he felt the perspiration rise from the pools and hollows of his face, to flow in a thin tide down his cheeks. He licked his lips and shut his eyes. Now, next on the agenda, what? The spinal cord. Yes, here, slowly, he examined it, in the same way he operated the many push-buttons in his office, thrusting them to summon secretaries, messengers. But now, in these pushings of his spinal column, fears and terrors answered, rushed from a million doors in his mind, to confront and shake him. His spine felt horribly unfamiliar, like the brittle shards of a fish freshly eaten, its bones left strewn on a cold china platter. He seized the little rounded nobbins. Lord, Lord, his teeth began to chatter. God Almighty, he thought, why haven't I realized it in all these years? All these years I've gone around with a skeleton inside me. How is it we take ourselves for granted? How is it we never question our bodies and our being? A skeleton, one of those jointed, snowy, hard things, one of those foul, dry, brittle, gouge-eyed, skull-faced, shake-fingered, rattling things that sway from neck-change in abandoned webbed closets, one of those things found in the desert all long and scattered like dice. He stood upright, because he could not bear to remain seated. Inside me now, he grasped his stomach, his head. Inside my head is a skull, one of those curved carapaces which holds my brain like an electrical jelly, one of those cracked shells with holes in the front and two holes shot through it by a double-barreled shotgun, with its grottos and caverns of bone, its reverbements and placements for my flesh, my smelling, my seeing, my hearing, my thinking. A skull encompassing my brain, allowing it to exit through its brittle windows to see the outside world. He wanted to dash into the bridge party, upset it, a fox in a chicken yard, the cards fluttering all around like chicken feathers, burst upward in the clouds. He stopped himself only with a violent trembling effort. Now, man, control yourself. This is a revelation. Take it for what it's worth. Understand it. Savor it. But a skeleton! Screamed his subconscious. I won't stand for it. It's vulgar. It's terrible. It's frightening. Skeletons are horrors. They clink and tinkle and rattle in old castles, hung from oaken beams, mauling long, indolently rushing pendulums on the wind. Darling, will you come and meet the ladies? His wife's clear, sweet voice called from far away. Mr. Harris stood. His skeleton held him up. This thing inside, this invader, this horror was supporting his arms, legs, and head. It was like feeling someone just behind you who shouldn't be there. With every step, he realized how dependent he was on this other thing. "Darling, I'll be with you in a moment," he called weakly. To himself, he said, "Come on, brace up. You've got to go back to work tomorrow. Friday, you must make that trip to Phoenix. It's a long drive, hundreds of miles. Must be in shape for that trip, or you won't get Mr. Creldon to invest in your ceramics business. Chin up now." A moment later, he stood among the ladies, being introduced to Mrs. Withers, Mrs. Abelmat, and Miss Curthy, all of whom had skeletons inside them, but took it very calmly because nature had carefully clothed the bare nudity of clavicle, tibia, and femur with breasts, thighs, calves, and coiffure, and eyebrow satanic, with bee-stung lips. And "Lord!" shouted Mr. Harris inwardly. "When they talk or eat, part of their skeleton shows. Their teeth. I never thought of that. Excuse me," he gasped and ran from the room, only in time to drop his lunch among the petunias over the garden balustrade.